Hello again. Major concerns about a potential conflict on the Korean peninsula continue. What happens if the Democratic People's Republic of Korea conducts another missile or nuclear test? Will the United States respond? There is, of course, precedent for American military action in the DPRK going all the way back to the early 1950s in the Korean War. That confrontation also involved China and Russia. Later in the show, we will discuss how the origins and outcome of that conflict are still resonating today. But first, for the latest on the tensions, we begin with correspondent Shane Halm, who joins us from South Korea's capital, Seoul. Thanks so much for joining us. What's the very latest on the tensions? If another DPRK missile test or nuclear test happens, what sort of preparedness are we seeing in the South? And bring us up to date on the controversial deployment of the THAAD ballistic missile defense system too, if you would, Shane.
Sure, Nathan. Well, as far as South Korean forces are concerned here, they've maintained this heightened state of alert for some time now to watch out for any missile or nuclear tests. The country's acting president has ordered the military to keep a high level of readiness for any signs of possible provocations. But keep in mind that South Korean forces are in the midst of conducting joint military drills with U.S. versus Korea, and that's been taking place since late March, and they're scheduled to continue through the end of this month. Now, these drills, of course, have taken place for decades now and are often the target of criticism from the DPRK. And speaking of these drills, you also have the USS Carl Vinson Strike Group reportedly expected to arrive sometime this week. And we also know that, as you mentioned, U.S. and South Korean forces are pushing through with their deployment of this THAAD anti-missile defense system, much to the dismay of neighboring countries like China. So all this, these shows of forces, they're all high-profile examples here that the allies want to show. Whether it works as a deterrent or not is another issue, but so far we haven't seen any signs of any sort of missile test or nuclear test, despite what many experts are anticipating that it could happen, is imminent, that they're saying.
Yeah, Shane, as you were talking, we're just playing some video there of demonstrations as the THAAD missile system is installed there. Tensions in Seoul and the rest of the Republic of Korea seem high. Are people worried? Is there an expectation that all of this can still be resolved peacefully? And there are tensions with the U.S. ally, right?
Right. Peaceful resolution is always the hope. Any outright military conflict would be disastrous here. Keep in mind, there's nearly 30,000 U.S. troops stationed in the ROK alone, and tens of thousands in Japan as well. They'd all be in harm's way if any sort of military engagement were to occur. But for ordinary South Koreans, the majority have lived with a divided Korean peninsula their entire lives. It's been 6.5 decades since the end of the Korean War. Where I'm sitting in Seoul is about an hour's drive to the DMZ, which happens to be the most heavily armed border in the world. But if you walk the city streets, you'd never imagine that thousands of troops across the border are so close here, and people go about their daily lives. There's no evidence of people going out and hoarding basic necessities right now. If anything, the upcoming presidential election here and the recent political scandal and impeachment involving, of course, former President Park Geun-hye have been more on people's minds. But obviously, national security is always a major topic, especially with this presidential campaign going on. So it'll be interesting to see how it affects the outcome of the election with voters here headed to the polls on May 9th.
Shane, thanks. And it's worth remembering that one of the leaders in that election expected to win, it does have reservations about the THAAD deployment as well. Thanks so much. OK, let's get to our panel. With me here in the studio is Brian Becker. He's visited the DPRK several times. He's an analyst on US-Korea relations and no stranger to this show. He's author of The Imperialism in the 21st Century. Also with us from Beijing is Tong Zhao. He's a fellow at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. And joining us via Skype is Peter Kuznick. He's professor of history at American University and is co-author of the Oliver Stone's Untold History of the United States. And also with us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, is Myung-Koo Kang. He is professor of political science at Baruch College. Welcome, all of you, to the show. I want to start actually with Peter and play a bit of that documentary that he did with Oliver Stone, The Untold History. The reason is because this kind of sets up the historical context of where we are. It's about the Korean War and also US policy there. Let's just watch it, and then, Peter, I'll get your reaction off the back.
World War II hero General Douglas MacArthur had pushed north towards the Chinese border, despite repeated warnings from Beijing, assuring Truman that the Chinese would never enter the war. In the late fall of 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops streamed across the Yalu River, sending U.S. and Allied forces reeling backwards in a frantic retreat.
The Marines who spearheaded the breakout did not consider it a retreat. Retreat hell, said their commander. We're just advancing in a different direction.
Time magazine called it the worst defeat the U.S. had ever suffered. Truman wrote in his diary, "World War III is here." MacArthur repeatedly and Truman separately threatened to use the bomb.
And by bomb, they mean nuclear weapons. And also, we didn't have time to play it there, but the US also threatened to bomb Chinese ports and also bring in the KMT back to the Chinese mainland. So there's all this sort of stuff going on. Peter, how do you think what you wrote there for that documentary sort of fits into this tension era we're now in?
Well, Americans tend to not have very much historical memory. But people in other parts of the world have much greater historical memory. And North Koreans remember this history. They remember the Korean War. They know that the United States attacked them. Not only did the United States attack them, the United States leveled North Korea to the ground. The United States' preferred weapon of choice there was napalm, but we firebombed all of North Korea's cities. The consequences were simply devastating. And that, literally, every city in North Korea was burned to the ground. The death toll, we don't have an exact death toll in that war, but the estimates, the best estimates I've seen, is that 3 to 4 million Koreans died, 1 million Chinese died, and 37,000 or so Americans died. So this was not a simple war. We're talking about a tenth of the population of Korea, North and South, was killed in that war. So they have a memory of this. And to them, they know that the United States has been threatening, that the United States has been threatening again to use nuclear weapons, that we were seriously considering using nuclear weapons during the original Korean War, and that it was not only MacArthur. One of the mistakes people make is they think MacArthur was fired by Truman because he was threatening to use nuclear weapons. That was not why MacArthur got fired. In fact, when Ridgway took over from MacArthur, he immediately called for the use of 38 nuclear weapons.
Peter, this is a great historical background. I want to bring in our other guests to talk about this. Let's talk to Myung-Koo Kang in Cambridge, Massachusetts. You know, given the long historical memory between North and South, how much of what happened in the Korean War is still part of the thinking in today's tensions from Seoul's point of view?
I mean, those older people who still remember the Korean War, it's a big deal. And then still, those old people, for instance, more than 70 years old, they vividly remember the Korean War and devastating consequences of the war. So here in the United States, the Korean War is a kind of forgotten war. But in the Korean context, it is still very, very critical in political and historical aspect, because many people have been killed, were killed because of the Korean War. So some people should take a political responsibility about the war itself.
Let's go to Beijing. Tong Zhao, obviously the Korean War is not a forgotten war when it comes to Chinese history. In terms of the historical experience that we've had over the last 70 years, it hasn't always been one of confrontation, has it? There have been periods, for example, in the late 90s, early 2000s, where it looked like we could have seen the end of nuclear ambitions of the DPRK and some sort of ending of this war and security guarantees. What happened and why did it go wrong?
Well, indeed, throughout history, there were multiple occasions in which we almost came to a full resolution of the North Korean nuclear crisis. The first case came in 1994 when the framework agreement was reached. The problem at that time was, even though the White House was very interested in implementing the agreement, the U.S. Congress, especially when the Congress was later controlled and dominated by the Republicans, they really hated this agreement and threatened to withdraw, just like what we have witnessed after the recent Iran nuclear deal was signed. So from the North Korean perspective, they really doubted the U.S. capability to implement the agreement. Therefore, they felt they couldn't trust the U.S. in the future. So they decided they had to sought another route toward developing a nuclear capability. So the similar dynamics played out multiple times. It's the lack of trust between the major stakeholders really contributed to the failures of previous agreements.
Brian Becker, do you agree with that? If you take where the Korean Peninsula is in a historical context, obviously we had the Korean War, but we had the Vietnam War, for example, with the US. We had the Cold War, where the Soviet Union was largely the protector of the DPRK, and that came to an end with the end of the Soviet Union. So what does history advise us about where we are now?
Right after the Soviet Union fell, the United States policymakers believed firmly that North Korea would fall too, that there would be regime change. North Korea wasn't going to fall. It learned the lesson of what happened in the Soviet Union. It adopted what they called as a military-first policy. That led to a near war in 1994. That then was resolved with the General Framework Agreement. From there, you had the North Koreans agreeing to suspend nuclear weapons development. And there was the Kim Dae-jung government in South Korea, the Sunshine Policy, leading to a possible rapprochement in 1999,
meeting in 2000.
Kim Jong-il and Kim Dae-jung met together, and Madeleine Albright, then Secretary of State, went to Pyongyang and met with Kim Jong-il. If the Clinton administration had been in power for another year, I think there would have been a normalization. But George W. Bush came in, he treated Kim Dae-jung rudely, and he proclaimed North Korea as part of the axis of evil, along with Iran and Iraq, prepared to invade a disarmed Iraq. And North Korea said, well, guess what? We're leaving the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we are getting nuclear weapons. And since then, the situation has frozen. There could have been a change. There could have been negotiations. There still can be a change. It's going to be on a different basis, though.
Peter, do you agree with that, that some of the DPRK's reactions were because of US reactions post-Cold War, instead of moving to settle this long simmering conflict, that actually tensions rose up?
I agree with Brian. Yes, there was an 8-year period there when North Korea froze its plutonium production. They abandoned it. They gave up their nuclear programs. They were hoping for a peaceful settlement with the United States. First of all, they wanted to once and for all end the Korean War. You know, the war ended with an armistice. There was never a peace treaty at the end of that war.
Hence, no security guarantees for the North. Yeah.
And they wanted what they wanted, and even now, their demands are fairly straightforward. They want an end to the U.S. And South Korean war games that are going on constantly. You have to look at this from the perspective of the North Koreans. When the U.S. invaded Iraq, the North Koreans said that the only mistake that Saddam Hussein made was not having nuclear weapons. If Saddam had nuclear weapons, the United States could not have invaded. They drew the same lesson from Libya.
Libya, yes.
What did Gaddafi do? He gave up his weapons of mass destruction, abandoned his nuclear and other programs, and then the United States supports the overthrow and Gaddafi's death.
I want to bring in Myung-Koo Kong here to talk a little bit about the view from the South. Obviously, you're in the middle of election season after a very turbulent time in South Korean politics. And I understand that the front runner also has some concerns about U.S. military deployment of THAAD. How is the people feeling right now, and given the historical context that we've just been talking about as well?
Basically, we need to understand, I can observe the huge perception gap between the United States and South Korea. Many South Korean people have felt that their voice, genuine voice, has been marginalized in the course of determining the policy in dealing with the North Korean nuclear crisis at the moment. For instance, the President Trump made it quite clear that Carson, strike war group would be dispatched to the Korean Peninsula, but it was not kept. Right. So the South Korean people feel that it's a kind of cheated kind of disbelief. So we can see that if any kind of war breaks out on the Korean Peninsula, the negative consequences would be horrible to the South Korean people. But in terms of dealing with the North Korean nuclear crisis at the moment, surgical attack or preemptive attack has been quite seriously considered by the U.S. government, but it has not been quite close consultation with the Korean government. Of course, the Korean political situation right now in a political vacuum situation, but even under such kind of situations, President Trump did not talk with the acting president of the South Korean government.
Can I just follow up one question with you? What's your feeling on the fast deployment of the THAAD missile system? Do you think the Americans want to get it operational before a new government potentially hostile comes in? And also just answer this one other question. Obviously, Japan is part of the alliance. What is the feeling between Seoul and Tokyo right now? Because you guys are not on the same page about this crisis as well, right?
Right. But, okay, the current most strongest presidential candidate, Moon Jae-in, he made it quite clear the newly established government should to negotiate about the THAAD deployment with the U.S. government. Because China's government made it quite clear if South Korean government deploy the THAAD missile defense, if that's the case, China's government will launch more retaliatory measures. So at the moment, the Chinese government made quite clear that it's going to prevent travel to South Korea, even targeting the specific company which provided THAAD site to the Lotte company. But the thing is that in terms of understanding this North Korean nuclear crisis, we can observe another huge perception gap between Japan and South Korea as well. When quite recently, the Japanese government launched the emergency drills, targeting young people and then children, preparing for potential missile attacks from the north. But we should understand that in the South Korean context, South Korean people had to deal with such kind of situation for the past 7 decades.
Interesting. And let's bring in Tong Xiao here. Now, Chinese diplomacy obviously in full swing at the moment. We've had, for example, Wang Yi, the foreign minister at the NPC, lay out this dual-track approach, which was the idea of an end or a freezing of the exercises we've been talking about between the ROK and the US in return for a potential freeze of testing ballistic missiles and nuclear testing by the north, and then some sort of pathway going forward. Let's just listen to him in Germany in the last 24 hours, because this is a message being repeated.
The most pressing issue right now is to take up negotiations again. All conflict parties have to work on that. I highly value it that Foreign Minister Gabriel supported our initiative. That's surely only a first step. Our ultimate goal is very clear, the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. This peninsula must see a sustainable and long-term security mechanism and freedom.
Tong Xiao, Wang Yi was obviously referring to the German foreign minister there. Where is China's diplomacy right now, considering also the Trump administration is saying they want the Chinese to put more economic leverage on the DPRK? Is there a way to get to what Wang Yi is proposing?
I think China has already trying, very hard to cooperate with the U.S. to impose additional economic pressure onto North Korea. The problem is there's only so much that China can do more in that direction. After several rounds of UN Security Council resolutions, we have almost sanctioned anything available about North Korea. There is not much more that we can do. And the recent rhetoric from the U.S. government about the military option really further intensifies the tensions in the region. So from the Chinese perspective, a military strike would be too risky for everyone in the region. And we cannot really hope that a slightly increased economic pressure will force North Korea to denuclearize. So the only solution possible going forward is really to freeze the further development of North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities before we can hope for a more radical agreement on denuclearization. And therefore, I think China is now making a lot of efforts, hoping that both of the two major stakeholders in North Korea and the United States can be more open to the idea of a near-term agreement that can diffuse the tension and have both parties at the negotiating table.
Brian, the U.S. has talked about additional sanctions, secondary sanctions, pretty almost like what happened with Iran before the nuclear agreement, financial, but also an oil embargo. Now, anyone knows their histories about oil embargo in Asia. This is a very risky thing, especially for countries that require massive oil imports. Do you see them doing that, and what do you think the effects are going to be?
Well, that would depend on their ability to influence China, really, on the question of oil. Of course, you're referring to how World War II started, I think, with the oil boycott of Japan. The United States is ratcheting up economic pressure on DPRK and insisting that China do the same. I think they're trying to see if there's a way to separate the DPRK from China, in which case, if they feel the DPRK is more isolated, that would, I think, allow the Trump administration to countenance the idea of even more aggressive actions. Let's remember, this is largely a manufactured crisis. Nothing has changed in terms of what the DPRK is doing, say, from what it was doing a year ago, including its offers to suspend its missile tests or nuclear weapons tests in exchange for canceling the military exercises that simulate the destruction of their country. Nothing has really changed. The Trump administration, for its own purposes, is ratcheting up those tensions, creating an atmosphere of crisis. Now, what's the purpose of that? Is it to impact the South Korean election so that the Minju party, the Liberal Party, doesn't get elected? Is it in order to mute Trump's domestic critics, because they're all lauding him right now? The critics, including the mainstream media here, which were denouncing Trump, once he started bombing Syria or threatening war against North Korea, they're all applauding. They're saying, hey, this is what it means to act presidential. In other words, the Trump administration has its own motives. But is there a solution? North Korea will instantly reciprocate if there was a genuine offer for a peace treaty or even the diminution of tensions based on perhaps seeing the framework of freezing or putting a cap on its nuclear program in exchange for a normalization of relations. Most wars have a beginning. They all have a beginning. They all have an end, except this war never has an end. Why not?
I'm glad you said this, because what you basically framed is this a departure of the Trump administration from the Obama administration, who had this policy of strategic patience, as it was called. And we were told that the strategic patience era is over. We had Vice President Pence go over to Asia, looking tough on the DMZ, all that sort of stuff. But the Trump administration briefed senators today, and they issued this statement from Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, and also Defense Secretary James Mattis and the National Intelligence. And I want to read you part of it. The president's approach aims to pressure North Korea into dismantling its nuclear, ballistic, missile, and proliferation programs by tightening economic sanctions and pursuing diplomatic measures with our allies and regional partners. That sounds like strategic patience, doesn't it?
Well, that would be strategic patience if, in fact, that's the real policy. I think what the Trump administration right now is saying, look, we don't want to start a war. We don't want to initiate a war. We're not that reckless. We want the North Koreans to abandon their nuclear program. But let's face facts. North Korea will not give up its nuclear deterrent for all the reasons we've talked about, Iraq, Libya, all of their lessons from history. The question is, will the Trump administration genuinely want a solution, which means not denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but freezing the Korean nuclear program in exchange for a normalization of relations?
Thanks for your answer. Peter, I want to just put this in historical context. The Trump administration say it's a national security interest if the North Koreans, DPRK, develop an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile that could hit the mainland of the US. Given you're a student of the history of the Cold War, if the DPRK did develop that strategy, do you think the US would have to react or trying to do that militarily before that happens? And is it a big threat?
The US would react, and it does pose a potential threat. They already have the capability. You have to realize we've got 28,500 US troops in South Korea. They already have that artillery on the border there.
So they could already hit the U.S. troops, yes.
They can hit you not only 28,500, but there's also 200,000 American citizens in South Korea. The Seoul area is a very dense area population-wise, and it's got 20 million people in that area. So even before we have to worry about the ICBMs being able to hit mainland United States, they can wreak incredible amounts of damage and destruction in that area. So the threat is already there. It's a time, as we're all saying, that sober people have got to sit down and act like adults. The problem is Donald Trump does not know how to act like an adult. And he draws red lines. And he says that if the Chinese can't solve this problem, then we're going to do it ourselves.
Okay. Thank you. I want to bring in Myung-Koo Kong for a final word here. You know, where do you think this is going in terms of the Korean Peninsula? Do you think the tensions can be resolved, or do you think we're in for more weeks and months of brinkmanship?
It's a very tough question. It depends, but let me highlight, we need to learn from historical references. For instance, when the first North Korean nuclear crisis happened in 1993, it lasted about 18 months. In the end, United States and then North Korea agreed, reached an agreed framework. And then that framework worked quite successfully for 8 years. And then going back to the 2002, President Bush announced North Korea as one of those axis of evil countries. But about 1.5 years later, the United States agreed to launch 6-party talks. So in terms of understanding the effectiveness of military sanction or military options in dealing with the North Korean crisis, we need to also think about other diplomatic and economic and secondary sanctions, all possible options.
Thank you very much. Jaw is better than war, I heard once. Thank you so much, everyone. Myung-Koo Kong out of Miami. Thank you very much, Peter Kucinich as well, and Tong Zhao in Beijing. Brian Bettler here too in the studio. That's all we have time for. Thanks for joining us on this edition of The Heat. Please tune in